I knew the second he leaned back in that overpriced ergonomic chair, lips curling like he'd just won some petty office duel, that this was going to be one of those days people gossip about for years. His voice carried that smug, lazy confidence of a man who thought job titles were personality traits. Badge, laptop, and dignity. On my desk. Now. No preamble, no explanation, just a public execution in front of HR and two wide-eyed junior analysts who froze like they'd stumbled onto the end scene of a crime show. He even paused after dignity like he was expecting a laugh track. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a quip. No pleading, no bargaining. I took my badge off with one smooth motion, set it next to the laptop I'd already powered down, and for good measure, placed my coffee mug beside them like I was staging a photo shoot for office clearance sale. Then I turned and walked out. The air in the hallway felt heavier, like the building itself knew something was about to shift. Out in the parking lot, I didn't cry. I didn't fume. I sat in my car, hands on the wheel, feeling oddly clear-headed. 18 years at that company, and this kid, this resume-padding blow-in from some consultancy firm, thought he could strip me of my dignity with a rehearsed line and a smirk. The insult barely scratched the surface compared to the bigger truth. He had no idea who he'd just fired. Because buried under the polite, cardigan-wearing employee they'd known all these years was someone who had quietly, methodically built the skeleton key to the entire operation. Their logins, their secure portals, every encrypted handshake that made the company tick. It all passed through a service called Auth-Guard Solutions. A service I had founded years before they ever offered me a desk. And tucked neatly into the master license agreement, written in black and white, was a clause so simple it should have been impossible to miss. The license was valid only while I remained employed there. Terminate me, and the license terminated with me. I pulled out of the lot slowly, almost savoring the thought. It wasn't revenge yet, not exactly. At that moment, it was just a reminder to myself that the game wasn't over. It was barely starting. The company might not feel the ripples today, but they were coming. And when they hit, they wouldn't be ripples anymore. They'd be waves. Driving home, I thought about how many times over the years I'd fixed things in the shadows. Locked out accounts at 3 a.m. on a Sunday, executives who couldn't remember their own passwords before big presentations, sudden security breaches that could have sunk us if I hadn't acted fast. The bosses never remembered those moments, but I did. And I remembered how each thank you from upper management was quickly followed by more work dumped on my plate without more pay. By the time I got home, the anger had cooled into something much sharper. I poured a cup of tea, sat at my kitchen table, and opened my personal laptop. I logged into the Auth-Guard admin panel, my admin panel, and checked the license status. Active, still ticking away because the HR paperwork hadn't yet fully processed on their end. But when it did, that master key was going to vanish. Every single employee, from the summer intern to the CEO, was going to find themselves staring at a login page with no way through. I closed the laptop without making a move. Timing mattered. If I wanted this to hurt the right people, I needed to let them walk face first into the problem. No warning shots, no gentle nudges. Just the inevitable moment where the arrogant smirk on my new boss's face dissolved into confusion, then fear, then panic. I leaned back in my chair, sipping my tea, and let the silence of my apartment wrap around me. For the first time in years, I wasn't tethered to a company phone, waiting for the next urgent message. I could feel my shoulders loosening, my pulse steadying. I was free. And they, though they didn't know it yet, were about to learn the real cost of firing the one person holding the keys to their kingdom. Out in that sterile office, my badge, my laptop, and my so-called dignity were sitting neatly on his desk. But the real leverage? That was still very much in my hands. And soon enough, the phone that wasn't ringing now would be lighting up with calls they'd never thought they'd have to make. The drive home felt strangely weightless, like I'd just stepped off a ride I'd been stuck on for far too many years. The skyline blurred past, the kind of gray afternoon that makes everything look like it's been dipped in dishwater. I wasn't replaying the scene in his office, no slow-motion humiliation, no mental rehearsals of what I should have said. That wasn't worth my time. Instead, I was thinking about something far more satisfying: Auth-Guard Solutions. That name probably meant nothing to him. It meant everything to me. I built it back when I was freelancing, long before this company even knew my name. At the time, it was just a neat little project, centralized authentication that could scale without breaking. Over the years, it became my ace in the hole, licensing it out under my own LLC while quietly integrating it into every nook and cranny of their infrastructure. Client portals, internal dashboards, code repos, payroll, all of it passed through Auth-Guard. And here's the kicker. Buried in the license agreement, right under the section with all the boring boilerplate, was a clause so clean it could cut glass. This license shall remain valid only while the named founder, my name, is actively employed by the licensee. Termination of employment, voluntary or otherwise, will result in immediate termination of the master license. No grace period, no exceptions. When I first wrote it, I never expected to need it. It was just a safeguard, a way of ensuring that if a company wanted to use my tech, They'd keep me on the payroll or negotiate new terms. For 18 years, it sat there quietly, collecting dust while I kept the whole system running like a silent janitor of the digital world. Nobody questioned it. Nobody even remembered it existed. Which meant when my boss smirked his way through my firing, he was swinging an axe through the very branch he was sitting on. Halfway home, I caught myself grinning in traffic. Not the polite, tight-lipped office smile I'd perfected over the years. A real one. The kind you get when you know something nobody else does. The sting of betrayal was dissolving, replaced by something colder, cleaner, calculation. They'd taken something from me today, sure. But they'd also handed me the perfect setup for a checkmate. I thought about the infrastructure map I'd drawn up years ago, every arrow leading back to Auth-Guard. If the license died, every arrow turned into a dead end. They'd try the usual tricks, backdoor accounts, recovery scripts, calling in outside consultants, but the system was built to reject anything without a valid master key. And the only way to get that key now? Through me. Pulling into my driveway, I felt that rare, electric clarity that only comes when the next move is obvious. I didn't need to rush. In fact, the longer I waited, the worse it would get for them. Right now, everything probably still worked fine. The HR paperwork wouldn't hit the system until later tonight, maybe early morning. By then, the first trouble tickets would start trickling in. Someone wouldn't be able to log into a client's account. A developer's push request would fail. Someone in accounting would get locked out of payroll. Little glitches at first, the kind you shrug off as bad luck. But by the time they realized it was systemic, it'd be too late. Every department would be frozen. Clients would be calling. Deadlines would explode. And that smug new boss of mine? He'd be sitting in his glass-walled office, watching his empire grind to a halt with no idea how to restart it. I shut off the car and just sat there for a minute, hands resting on the steering wheel. I wasn't going to storm back and demanding an apology. That wasn't my style. I was going to let the silence do the talking. Let them call me, not the other way around. And when they did, I'd be the calm, collected voice on the other end, reminding them exactly who they'd underestimated. As I walked into my house, I realized something strange. I didn't feel unemployed. Not in the way people describe it, with panic and dread creeping in. I felt untethered, lighter, like I'd been quietly carrying their whole operation on my back for nearly 2 decades and had finally set it down. And the beautiful part? They were about to find out just how heavy it really was. It started earlier than I expected. I'd figured on a full night's grace before the first cracks showed, maybe even until mid-morning tomorrow. But by 3 that afternoon, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. I glanced over, half expecting a spam call or a delivery notification. Instead, it was a text from Mark, one of the senior engineers I'd worked with for years. Hey, can't log in. Weird, no preamble, no context, just that. I could picture him at his desk, frowning at his monitor, trying the same password 3 different ways before giving up and messaging me out of old habit. Muscle memory. I wasn't even technically in his directory anymore, but in his head. I was still the fixer. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't like Mark, he was one of the good ones, but because this wasn't his problem to solve, and it sure as hell wasn't my job to swoop in anymore. Besides, this was just the first tremor. The real quake was still on its way. A few minutes later, my personal phone vibrated again. This time, it wasn't a text, it was a Slack notification, which made 0 sense, because my company's Slack account had been deactivated the moment I walked out. I unlocked my phone out of curiosity and saw the message sitting there like a little gift from the universe. Client portal is throwing 403s all over. Who's got the admin creds for Auth-Guard? This is blowing up. The sender clearly hadn't meant to ping me. My personal number must have been linked to some ancient contact record in Slack from years ago. I imagined them frantically typing, hitting send, and then realizing they'd just reached out to the one person their new boss had so publicly thrown out hours earlier. I chuckled, put the phone face down, and stood up. I walked into the kitchen, filled the kettle, and let the white noise of water hitting steel fill the silence. They were already panicking about client access, and from the sound of it, the license kill switch hadn't even fully propagated yet. That meant whatever they were seeing now was just the warm-up act. While the water heated, I leaned against the counter and thought about how predictable this all was. The arrogance of people who think systems run on magic rather than maintenance. The way they never notice the quiet hands keeping the machine from seizing up until those hands are gone. 18 years of invisible labor, and this was what happened less than a workday after I left. The kettle clicked off. I poured the water over the tea bag, watching the color bloom through the steam. Somewhere across town, IT was probably in a war room, dragging every spare laptop into the fray, running diagnostics, pinging servers. Someone from legal was probably being looped in, because when client systems go dark, contracts start whispering ugly things about breach penalties. And my new boss? I pictured him standing with his arms crossed, trying to project control while his voice pitched higher with every failed update. I carried my tea to the couch and sank into the cushions. I didn't check my phone again. I didn't need to. The messages would keep coming, each one more frantic than the last. I'd let them pile up like unread mail, a quiet monument to the fact that their safety net was gone. Sipping the tea, I felt no guilt. This wasn't sabotage. It was the natural consequence of a decision they made with their eyes wide shut. They wanted my badge, my laptop, and my dignity on the desk? Fine. But they forgot I still owned the lock, and they just tossed out the only person with the key. And now I thought, leaning back and letting the steam warm my face, all I had to do was nothing. Absolutely nothing. The machine was unwinding on its own, and I was finally on the outside, watching it happen like a slow-motion implosion. By dawn, the trickle had turned into a flood. I woke to the kind of stillness that used to feel impossible. No vibrating phone, no 6 a.m. Urgent emails, no pre-meeting Slack pings, just quiet. I padded into the kitchen, made coffee, and glanced at my phone out of habit. Even without opening any messages, I could see the storm brewing in the previews. A dozen texts from numbers I recognized, another half dozen from ones I didn't. Short bursts of panic, payroll locked, VPN dead, who reset prod, and the one that made me snort into my coffee. Do you still have admin access by any chance? Across town, in that glass box they called a headquarters, the real show was underway. By 8:15, every department was feeling it. Marketing couldn't open campaign dashboards. Sales couldn't log into the CRM. Engineers were locked out of the code repository entirely, their push requests bouncing back like undeliverable mail. Even HR, smug, always on schedule HR, couldn't access payroll. Half the company's life support systems had flatlined overnight. And then there was my old boss. I imagined him striding into the IT pit, all swagger and volume, trying to drown out the fact that he had no clue what was happening. In his world, any problem was just a temporary glitch. In reality, the master license for Auth-Guard Solutions had quietly expired in the middle of the night, and the entire authentication layer had gone dark. No master key meant no logins, period. Reports would have been piling up in the incident tracker, each tagged critical. Red banners across internal systems screaming access denied. Clients calling in, their own logins dead, wondering if they'd been hacked. And there he was, snapping at the IT director to fix it, like you could reboot a system whose brain had just been lobotomized. The irony was almost too perfect. He'd stood in front of HR less than 24 hours ago, smugly telling me to leave my dignity on his desk, not realizing that what he was really taking was the only person who knew where the keys to the kingdom were and how to use them. Now those same keys were gone, and he was pounding on a locked door with no idea it had been welded shut from the outside. I pictured the escalation chain spinning out of control. IT trying recovery scripts that failed instantly. Project managers holding emergency stand-ups with no tools to manage them. The finance team staring at blank dashboards, wondering how they were supposed to close out the quarter when the accounting platform wouldn't even let them in. Every fix would run headfirst into the same wall, authentication error. But the real fun was still ahead. Right now, most people probably thought this was an isolated outage. A server hiccup, maybe a bad patch pushed overnight. They'd tell themselves it would be resolved by lunch. By early afternoon, they'd start realizing it wasn't a glitch. By evening, they'd be wondering if it was recoverable at all. I took another sip of coffee and looked out the window. The air outside felt crisp, sharp. Somewhere out there, a man who thought he'd made his mark by firing me was learning, in real time, that the mark he'd actually made was on the hull of his own ship, and the water was coming in fast. I set my mug down and smiled because the best part of all this was how little I had to do. I'd already set the dominoes up years ago. All I'd done yesterday was quietly step away and let gravity take over. The collapse wasn't coming, it had already begun, and I was exactly where I wanted to be, on the outside, dry, warm, and watching. By mid-morning, the false optimism had burned off like fog under a summer sun. IT had exhausted the turn it off and back on phase hours ago, and now the escalation chain had reached the point where people were asking dangerous questions. The kind of questions that didn't have easy answers. Somewhere in a cramped conference room, the IT director was pulling up flowcharts, tracing arrows through authentication logs. Every login attempt, every failed handshake, every piece of traffic had one thing in common. It was routing through a vendor most of them had never even heard of. The name sat there at the top of the diagram in neat sans serif letters, Auth-Guard Solutions. The IT director leaned back and said, "We don't have an account with these people, do we?" Heads turned toward the project managers. Blank stares. A few murmurs about maybe checking old vendor contracts. Nobody in that room realized they were staring at the beating heart of the company's security system, because to them, it was just background infrastructure, something that had always been there, quietly doing its job. Except the CFO. He wasn't in the room, but when the diagram landed in his inbox, something flickered at the edge of his memory. Years ago, before this current wave of execs, before the glass walls and culture refresh slogans, he'd signed off on an agreement for an authentication platform a senior hire had personally vouched for. A woman who had integrated it herself, made it bulletproof, and swore it could handle growth for decades. The woman, incidentally, who had just been escorted out of the building yesterday afternoon. He rubbed his temples, trying to remember the details. Something about the license being tied to her, but he'd assumed it was symbolic, just a way of marking her as the primary contact. He had no idea it was literal. And by the time he connected those dots, the legal team was already on the phone with Auth-Guard Solutions, trying to figure out why their master license was suddenly dead in the water. The conversation was short. The rep, cheerful, almost apologetic, confirmed the account existed, confirmed the system was functioning perfectly on their end, and confirmed the reason for the outage. Your master license agreement states continued access is contingent upon the active employment of the named founder. That employee is no longer listed as active in your system. As of 2:17 a.m., the license was automatically terminated. There was no wiggle room in the wording. No, maybe we can push an update, or we'll give you a courtesy extension. It was like a circuit breaker had tripped, and the only person who knew where the panel was had just been fired. I imagined the legal team trying to explain this to my old boss. Watching his expression move from irritation to confusion to that slow, dawning horror when he realized the vendor he'd never heard of was the only reason the company could function at all. Watching him try to mask it with bluster, while mentally calculating how long it would take to rebuild an authentication system from scratch. The clock was already ticking. Every minute meant more clients locked out, more deadlines slipping, more revenue bleeding into the gutter. And the beauty of it, they were still in the stage where they thought they could solve it without me. They didn't know it yet, but they were standing in a room with a locked door, and the key wasn't just gone, it was sitting in my kitchen drawer next to the spoons. And I wasn't planning to hand it over for free. The call came just after lunch, right when I was halfway through a leftover pasta and enjoying the kind of slow, unhurried day I hadn't had in almost 2 decades. My phone lit up with a number I knew by heart, main company line, direct from the fortress of glass walls and bad decisions. I let it ring twice, just long enough to make him wonder if I'd pick up, before I swiped. His voice was different, still carrying that sharp edge he thought made him sound in control, but softer now, frayed at the edges. Hey, he started, the fake familiarity already grating, we need you to unlock the system. Not could you, not would you mind. It was phrased like a demand, but the undertone was pure plea. The kind of tone people use when they're trying to wrap desperation in authority. I let the silence stretch just long enough for him to feel it. Then, evenly, you'll have to take that up with Auth-Guard Solutions. A pause. I could hear voices in the background. IT scrambling, legal talking over each other, the faint ping of incoming messages. Right, he said like he was trying to collect himself. We've spoken to them. They said the license is tied to you. That's correct, I replied. My voice stayed calm, flat. And as I'm no longer employed there, the license is terminated. Their system is functioning exactly as it should. Another pause, longer this time. I imagined him gripping the phone tighter, weighing his next move. So what would it take to get you to reinstate it? The question came out grudging, like it hurt to even let the words pass his lips. I didn't smile, not out loud anyway. Inside, I was savoring the shift. Less than 24 hours ago, he was smirking in front of HR, stripping me of my so-called dignity. Now he was calling me, using my first name like we were partners on the same side of a crisis. The whiplash was delicious. I'm not in a position to discuss that right now, I said, keeping my tone as neutral as a customer service script. You have Auth-Guard's contact information. I suggest you work through them. Before he could respond, I hung up. Not abruptly enough to seem petty, just cleanly, decisively, like the conversation had reached its natural end. I set the phone down and took another bite of pasta, as if nothing had happened. The truth was, that call had told me everything I needed to know. They were past the point of pretending this was a minor outage. They'd hit the wall and realized there was no way over it without me. I kept my poker face for a reason. The longer they sat in that stew of uncertainty, the better my position became. Every hour that passed was another missed deliverable, another angry client, another board member asking uncomfortable questions. And the more pressure they felt, the more willing they'd be to meet terms they'd scoff at today. Outside, the winter light was fading, casting long shadows across the floor. Inside, I felt no rush, no urge to chase. They'd already made the first move, and it wasn't even close to their last. The balance of power had shifted, and they knew it. The only question left was how much it was going to cost them to shift it back. By the next morning, the ripples had turned into tidal waves crashing straight into the boardroom. From what I heard later, through the kind of back-channel gossip that survives any security breach, the CEO had called an emergency meeting at 8 a.m. sharp. Not one of those polite, agenda-driven check-ins. This was the kind where people showed up pale, clutching coffee they didn't have time to drink, because the company's top 5 clients were threatening to walk before the week was out. The meeting started with IT running through the facts. Access failure was now total. Internal tools, client portals, vendor integrations, payroll, code repositories, all dead. Overnight workarounds had failed. Attempts to bypass the vendor authentication layer had failed. Even trying to spin up new accounts had failed. Every road led back to one gate, and that gate was welded shut. Then came the part that must have felt like a gut punch. Someone, finally, pulled up the original Auth-Guard Solutions license agreement. No one had bothered to read it in years. It was one of those ancient PDFs buried in a shared drive, labeled something boring like vendor auth contract final PDF. But there it was, plain as daylight. This license shall remain valid only while the named founder, my full name, is actively employed by the licensee. Termination of employment, voluntary or otherwise, result in immediate termination of the master license. No exceptions, no vague language, no wiggle room, ironclad. Whoever had drafted it had done so with surgical precision. The room reportedly went quiet enough to hear the HVAC hum. The CFO cleared his throat, already sweating. So she was fired yesterday. That's when one of the board members, an older guy who'd been there since the company's scrappy days, turned in his chair and looked directly at my old boss. Why, he asked slowly, did you fire the only person holding the keys to the kingdom? From what I gather, my boss tried to play it off. Some nonsense about organizational restructuring, cost optimization, and aligning talent with future needs. But the more he talked, the more his voice wavered. Because in that moment, surrounded by stone-faced executives, couldn't dress this up as anything other than what it was, a catastrophic miscalculation with his fingerprints all over it. The CEO didn't say much, but when he did, it was sharp enough to cut the air. Do you have a plan to fix this? My boss stammered something about IT making progress. The IT director, God bless him, cut in without hesitation. With respect, no, we're not. There's no fix without her. The silence that followed must have been brutal. I imagine the board members exchanging glances, the realization settling like wet cement. The company wasn't dealing with a system outage. It was dealing with the consequences of firing the one person who was the system. Phones buzzed throughout the meeting, angry client emails, news of contracts being put under review. Every passing hour meant lost revenue and a shrinking window to contain the damage. And there was my boss, sitting at the center of the storm he'd created, forced to explain why his first big move had been to cut loose the only person keeping the entire operation from collapsing. I could almost picture it, him gripping the edge of the table, feeling the room tilt against him, realizing for the first time that this wasn't just his problem anymore. This was his legacy taking shape, one disastrous decision, written in real time, with me as the footnote that would haunt him for the rest of his career. It didn't take long for the cracks to spread beyond the boardroom. By midday, the story had slipped out through the usual hairline fractures, an overheard call here, a disgruntled client there. Within hours, word was circulating among vendors and major accounts. The company had lost control of its own authentication system. Not having issues, not under maintenance. Lost control. For big clients, that phrase was the equivalent of shouting fire in a crowded theater. Vendor partners started quietly locking down integrations, afraid the outage would bleed into their systems. Clients called their legal teams to review exit clauses. A few went straight to the press, threatening to leak the story unless they got assurances my old boss couldn't give. I could imagine him now, sitting under those recessed boardroom lights, the CEO across from him, half the board leaning forward like wolves scenting blood. Do you have a backup plan? One of them asked flat, no sugar. His answer, according to the little bird who still had my number, was the death knell. No, the system was centralized. A pause then under pressure, there's no way to restore full access without her. The board members didn't even try to hide their reactions. A few shook their heads, one laughed under his breath. The CEO's expression was the worst of all. Not angry, not even disappointed, just cold, calculating. The look of someone already measuring whether your career is worth salvaging. By the time they adjourned, the public crack was turning into a fault line. Clients were CCing half the executive team in blistering emails. Vendors wanted immediate written proof that the problem was under control. No one was buying the official technical difficulties line anymore. You can only use that excuse for an hour, maybe two, not going into the second day. Meanwhile, my own inbox, personal, not corporate, was starting to look like a negotiation table. The first few messages were polite. Hey, maybe we could chat? Then came the slightly more urgent. We're hoping to resolve this quickly. Can we discuss terms? By the end of the day, they dropped the corporate polish entirely. Name your number, please. The shift in tone was almost artistic. Less than 48 hours ago, I was being told to leave my dignity on his desk. Now the same people were practically on their knees, asking me to hand them the keys to their own front door. I didn't respond. Not yet. Let them sweat a little longer. Every passing hour tightened the vice, and I knew the precise moment to make my move was still ahead. I could see the arc of it so clearly. The rising panic, the public embarrassment, the breaking point where pride buckled under pressure. That's when I'd step in, calm, reasonable, in control. For now, I closed my laptop and made dinner, picturing that boardroom like a slow-motion collapse in an old building. You don't need to push when gravity's already doing the work. The invitation came through a neutral third party, someone from the board I actually respected. No corporate posturing, no veiled threats. Just a simple request. Would you be willing to attend a meeting to discuss a resolution? The tone told me everything I needed to know. They weren't calling me in to negotiate. They were calling me in to concede. The following morning, I walked into the same boardroom where my boss had staged his little power play just days earlier. The atmosphere was different now, tense, brittle, the air carrying that faint static of people who haven't slept enough. Around the long table sat the CEO, the CFO, half the board, and at the far end him. The smirk was gone. His skin had that pale, waxy look of someone who's been living under fluorescent lights and caffeine fumes, and his eyes barely met mine. They gestured for me to sit. I placed my folder on the table and opened it with the same calm precision I'd once used to troubleshoot their systems. Inside was a single document, my revised licensing proposal. I slid copies across the polished wood like a dealer laying down a winning hand. The terms were straightforward. There was no mistaking the shift in power. New rates, triple the original, payable upfront. A contract length long enough to make sure they wouldn't be tempted to restructure me out again anytime soon. And in a clause that made a few board members glance sideways at each other, a personal written apology from my former boss, acknowledging in plain language the misjudgment that had led to the termination of the license. That one wasn't for the money, it was for the principle. The CEO picked up the document, scanning it without a word. The CFO was already scribbling numbers, calculating what this rescue would cost. My old boss sat frozen, hands folded tightly in front of him like if he stayed still enough he might disappear into the leather chair. It didn't take long. The CEO set the papers down, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "We'll sign." The pen moved quickly, the signatures stacking in neat blue ink. When it came time for my old boss to sign his portion, his hand shook slightly. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just watched the moment he committed, on paper and in front of witnesses, to the most expensive lesson of his career. When the last page was done, I gathered the folder, stood, and thanked them for their time. The CEO nodded. The rest of the board avoided my eyes, already turning their focus to whatever damage control came next. I walked out of that glass fortress with the contract in my hand and the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd not only won, but had rewritten the rules of the game in the process. Behind me, I knew his career was over. Not immediately, maybe, but inevitably. A man doesn't survive a blunder this public, not when it's etched into the company's history as the week they lost control of their own gates. Outside, the cold air hit my face like a clean slate. They had their access back. I had my terms met, my leverage intact, and my so-called dignity exactly where it had always been, mine to keep. And this time, they knew it. You're the real MVPs of the office jungle. Thanks for watching. Smash that subscribe button, or the coffee pot might just forget your next brew.